I had the advantage when I began my anthropology work of having lived for 2 years in a Maasai district. And so I knew the terrain. I love the landscape, which is a bit like Wyoming or I suppose Alberta. Mountains in the distance, game, antelope, zebras, etc., wandering around. Where I was as a teacher, I lived in a small cement house, and there was an outhouse. And the outhouse, I can remember spending some time in the outhouse with the wind blowing and looking out and seeing gazelles and zebra right across the way. So it was a very a wonderful way to begin, and of course it gave me a taste for the field and the terrain and the people that I brought into my original work. And during that period, I was a teacher, and so people were extremely gracious and invited me to do various things. And one invitation was to go to a ritual. And so we all got into this large sort of bus that belonged to the school, and we went down to an area where they were having a ritual. And we saw what was going on. I didn't completely understand it all, and that was one reason why ritual became a question, a key question that I pursued. But that was a very powerful experience to see the Maasai coming together, all of the warriors in a group for a particular age set, which means a group that had been initiated during a certain, approximately 5-year period. And there they were able to dance, and as I later came to be aware of, they were going through a transition, a promotion ceremony. And I'll mention a bit more. But that was when I was a teacher, and that was an experience that lent me a certain interest in pursuing work with the Maasai. At the same time, I as a pre-anthropologist, I had some extraordinary trips around Kenya. I went to so many places. I had a group of friends, and some were Kenyans, and some of them were North Americans. And there was one fellow who was an Indian, because of course Kenya really has 3 major populations. There's a colonial presence, which is white. There's the Indian community, which has a long history in that area, and then there's the Kenyan, black Kenyan population. And these are 3 parts of an ethnic mosaic. And at one point, we drove north because we were on our way to Lake Turkana, which is up on the Ethiopian border. And we came to a road stop. We stopped and they said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "We're going to Lake Turkana." And they said, "No, you're not. Didn't you know that this is a block and that's a closed district?" I said, "No." Of course, we didn't have a clue when I looked back on it. And we were taken to see the district officer, and he said, "Who do you think you are? You could just go like that." And he said, "Where did you go to school?" He said to my friend. He said, "Well, I went to Buffalo." He said, "So did I." And he said, "You're going to come and stay in my house tonight." Okay, we stayed in his house, told stories. Next morning we had our permit and off we went. And it was just after the Shifta War, which was an important conflict between ethnic Somalis trying to secede from Kenya. And it was over by the time we were taking this trip, which is 1968. But we could see the residue, which was, was an after-war, post-conflict situation. And we went up and we began to see the pastoralists who were up in that area, Eastern Cushitic-speaking pastoralists, Barana, Gabra, Rendili, etc. And we stopped at some wells and saw them unloading the camels, etc. And we ended up at Lake Turkana, which is one of the most sort of stark and fascinating places in the world. It's a volcanic rock with fishing people who live along the side of the lake, and pastoralists who come down and use the water of the lake. And it was all very, just fascinating for me, a young man who was basically opening up to understanding, what was in this world, in this wonderful world, and came back. So these were a couple of experiences, and of course living there throughout, which made me feel that Kenya was a fascinating place. And I wanted to understand it more, and I wanted to understand it with some sort of depth of understanding. I couldn't just be somebody seeing images that were compelling. I wanted to somehow probe underneath and understand what these societies were all about and what their prospects were. So then my graduate studies, I, as I mentioned, did my master's on the Borana, which are southern Ethiopia. And so I wrote to Ethiopia to see if I could arrange research clearance. I wrote to Kenya to see if I could arrange research clearance. The Kenyans wrote back, the Ethiopians didn't. So it was quite easy that I continued to do my work in southern Kenya among the Maasai. And that was in many ways, I think, a very, very good decision. Field work. Of course, that's what anthropologists do. As it turned out, my wife came and taught in the medical school, and so she had an apartment in Nairobi. So that was a base. It turned out to be a base not just for me, but for a whole series of other field researchers working primarily in anthropology, but also history, who would come back, and we had a spare bedroom, and they would stay there. So it was a sort of an oscillation back and forth. I would go out for a number of weeks and then come back to rejuvenate my batteries and then go out again. The problem I was looking at was essentially one of identity, because I was fascinated by questions that were coming up basically through the subaltern studies in South Asia. What is the role? How much do anthropologists predispose what we find out because we're focused on the dominant population? And of course, in subaltern studies, it was essentially, much of anthropology was essentially a Brahmanic view on the culture. And my feeling was that there was maybe what we might call an overemphasis, but certainly a particular focus that was concerned with Maasai as pastoralists. And yet we knew there were all kinds of other sorts of Maasai. And so what I did was look at, from a structuralist point of view, look at the ways that identities were constructed through oppositions, where embedded within a particular form of, say, the Maasai as a pastoralist, were a set of embedded values and orientations that depended on there being the negative form. And of course they were there. They were all within the same society, but they were suppressed. And one of those, of course, was cultivators. There were Maasai cultivators, and many Maasai today are doing more and more cultivation, just out of, the world changes. But there we had cultivators who were in the South Rift, working on a side of an escarpment. We had cultivators who were in Tanzania, because the Maasai are a community that in one way or another, Ma speakers stretch all the way from the Ethiopian border through Tanzania and into Malawi. I mean, it's an incredible expansion. So we don't think of them in terms of that degree of expansion the way we do perhaps the Fulani across West Africa, or even the Nuer, because we use different names for each of the subgroups. But in fact, they speak closely related languages. So if we have cultivation and the values of cultivation, which are labor and the beauty of the soil, the pastoralists, it has to do with disdaining that sort of labor. You know, we are people who are dignified. We wouldn't do undignified labor. Or the notion that the soil essentially is something that holds grass and you don't want to penetrate it. You want to keep it whole because that creates a pasture land that is positive. Another contrast is the hunters and foragers. There's a whole group of people, they're called Dorobos or Okiek, and they are hunters and foragers, and they live in the forests, but essentially they're Ma speakers. The theory of, there have been various theories proposed, and one is that they are people who are dropping out of pastoralism because at various points you have a drought and people lose their livestock, and one theory is that they go into the forest, they become hunters. Another is that they are the residue of a long history of hunters who were in the region. And if we go back into the long-term history of Africa, it's clear that the San speakers occupied most of what we think of as Eastern Africa. And then you have the pastoralists, and then the cultivators coming in the form of the Bantu speakers. But here we have a group, and you can theorize their historical origins, but they were hand in glove with the Maasai. An integral part of the society, but often doing work that was essentially degrading. They would be cleaning the skins. They would do hunting. They dealt in blood products. They were potters. So many things that we recognize from South Asia, is also found, there are activities that are found there. And the major motif is a form of basically degradation. They see these as people who are degraded. That's a position from the pastoral point of view, because the pastoralists are constructing an image in which they themselves have redeeming qualities. So you find a niche being created in which the hunters are inserted. The third dimension that I identified and developed was the blacksmiths, who are forgers and smelters. So they're people who are a caste. Most Maasai don't want to touch them. They won't marry with them. They won't live in the same household with them. The idea is that they have an intrinsic sort of aspect of pollution. That is to say, they have what's called bitter blood. But they do something which is imperative. Of course, to be a Maasai, you can't deal with that. You need metal for your swords. You need metal for your spears. You need metal for the razor that you circumcise your children with, and therefore can make them adults. And there's a razor that you cut the umbilical cord that makes birth possible. So all these generative processes really depended on the metal worker. And the metal worker was aware of that and had a power over the Maasai because they had the power of the curse. And if anybody tampered with them, they could curse the particular metal that's being given. So you have this sort of reciprocity, the powerful pastoralists and the disempowered or basically polluted blacksmiths. And yet the blacksmith has ultimately control over the pastoralists. So you see the embedded set of ideas in which whatever the purity and the dignity of the pastoralists have is being purchased, in a sense, through a symbolic inversion with these other peoples. And then the last one is the ritual expert, or the Laibon, who is one who has the power of divination, the power of clairvoyance, and has a certain political position because they are consulted for every major decision in the society. And yet they are seen, people fear them, and because they have also a very powerful curse. So they also are set aside. So normal or regular Maasais feel they need them, they consult with them, and yet they fear them. So you have a whole series of in some sense, dimensions or small components of the Maasai persona are built up through these forms of opposition. And so it's very systematic. It's my way of trying to get at the issue of system. And so I've described in a few of the, a few articles, including an article called Being Maasai, Being People of Cattle, which I look at the ethnic shifters, that is to say, aspects of their identity which shift in context. So at one moment, so-and-so can be a Maasai. At another moment, they're a Dorobo, to be distanced. And pollution and pastoral anti-praxis, where I'm developing these elements of identity, which in fact depend on opposition. But at the same time, you have these as systems that I described, I think very elegantly, with diagrams, etc., following up on Levi-Strauss's great influence. Inversions are there, etc. But at the same time, we're talking about actual historical groups who are living there and interacting with Maasai. So it was my way of trying to say the Levi-Straussian or the structuralist genius isn't just to create ideal systems that are set aside. It's how is political and social life informed by such systematic symbolic relations. And I like to think that worked. I think over time, these distinctions have become less. People are citizens of a nation state. They have rights as citizens, and among them are land rights, etc. So today you'll find it discussed less, and yet you put your finger under the surface and it's all there still today. So that's this is a concern with identity that I had, and it's part of a link I had with the work of Robert Levine, who was also concerned with child development and the acquisition of identities, and that was a strong link between the two of us. At the same time, when I went out to do this work, I had an outline for my project, and then I got sidetracked because it was ritual season, and the ritual among the Maasai is something that's a real community activity. People, hundreds, thousands of people come together. They leave their homes. They go to a new village that is built. It's a huge village with houses, and they spend months there. And finally, they come to the final period of about 10 days when it has a culmination in the activity, the sacrifice, the consumption of meat, which brings the age group to a point of transition. And there were some ceremonies going on, and I got very excited. And so I began to visit and do ethnography on the rituals. And that was very exciting. I was slightly older than the warriors, but within reaching distance. So I tended to affiliate with the warriors, and I did a lot of things with them, and it was great fun. They used me for various purposes. I had a Land Rover, so that helped everybody get their transport. I can remember when one of the leaders came looking around and said, "John, keep this in your vehicle." And it was a spear, because he's not supposed to have a spear. He put the spear. Others would come up and say, "John, there's some maize meal," for a group that was actually very involved in agriculture. And they said, "We can't stand all this meat all the time. So keep this here so we can come back and get it." So I had a special relationship with the warriors. But I was able to track the evolution of two major rituals, the Eonoto, which is where the warriors essentially go through a transition out of warriorhood, or at least a step out of it. And the other is where the more elder people who would be coming up about 14 years later were doing a transition out of the system altogether, and they would come back as ritual fathers overseeing the next generation coming up, and that's called Olmesher, or the meat rack ceremony. So I followed those two, and it was really tremendous fun, tremendously interesting, because I began to discover that every single act, every ritual act, was embedded within a symbolic matrix. And the people couldn't always describe it. I mean, their job was to practice it, to make sure it was done properly. And they would turn back to the elders and say, how should we do this? And they would have a discussion. And I can remember one meeting where a chief, because there was this debate going on whether they should do it this way or that way. The chief stood up and said, well, you know, we wanted to do it the way God ordained that we should do it. That's important. We want to do it properly. But you know, if we do it this way or that way, for God, it's going to be all the same. And, you know, so the inventive or the improvisatory dimension of ritual, where the idea is you must do it exactly as it was done before, but within limits. So it has a sort of an aspect of creativity, and the structure of the ritual does evolve. And that was an important realization in my mind. So I began to see the ritual system as representing a whole. And it was something I came back to after I came to McGill. I went back and in effect, completed the study of the ritual system as a whole. I was able to go to the place where the ritual system begins, because to understand the social structure of the Maasai, you have something around 18 sections, which are autonomous political fragments that occupy territory. They're territorial units. It's much what Evans Pritchard described for the Nuer as tribes. Evans Pritchard didn't use tribe for the Nuer, he used it for their particular sections, and that's what are there. So what holds them together into some sort of unity, because they each have their own occupation, their own area that they occupy and they use, and that's how pastoralism gets done. And yet they have these relationships, and my thesis is that it's the ritual system that does it. Because you have your group coming up, and an age group is essentially engendered within a certain area. Young men are saying, we're ready to be circumcised, and they demand it, and they say, no, it's too early. Then finally, they come together, and they have this ceremony of the dance, which begins the whole process. And there's one place where they have to do the dance before all the others. And this is in a particular area in the Rift Valley, not too far away from Nairobi. So I went and I followed that one through, and was able then to look at that system as a whole. And one of the things that I did, which I think is interesting, was to map how do they actually plan their large village. And it turns out they were creating icons. They were in effect creating an icon of the society. So it was a way that if we're in the Catholic Church, we look at the church as representing, in some sense, the plan, which is all the different parts of the society. Well, this is what they were doing as well. And there were values that were being exemplified. and illustrated and acted out. I looked at it from the point of view of linguistics. There's the notion of the performative in linguistics. It was an idea that was engendered by Austin, where you have something like, the classical example is to get married. You say, I do. Well, you're not saying, I am about to do something. When the minute you say, I do, it's an action. It's done. And I think ritual plays that role within the field of action. That is to say, people do it, and the world is transformed. They're transformed as individuals, the age set is transformed, but the society itself is transformed as well. And so that is a fascinating thing. I look at the Maasai ritual system as equivalent to a grand opera in all the different parts, but also a system like the Catholic Church, where you have all these different parts. And it has that sort of structure, and it's marvelous.